Multiple independent surveys have detected anomalies beneath the Great Sphinx. Hollows south of its body, cavities beneath its paws, parallel surfaces that look, on radar, like the walls of a passage. And yet, in the 4 decades since the first of those readings, not a single excavation permit has been granted to investigate what is down there. That is the fact. Not a conspiracy, not a cover-up theory, just a documented finding, sitting in published survey data that almost nobody reads. The Sphinx is 73 meters long, 20 meters high, carved directly from the limestone bedrock of the Giza Plateau sometime around 2500 BCE, almost certainly during the reign of Khafre, builder of the second pyramid. It faces due east, toward the rising sun, and for most of its life, it has been buried to its shoulders in sand. Thutmose IV cleared the front paws around 1400 BCE and left a granite stela between them, recording a dream in which the Sphinx promised him the throne of Egypt. Then the sand came back. Napoleon's surveyors found it half submerged in 1798. A team led by Émile Barrès spent 11 years, from 1925 to 1936, finally stripping the monument clean, down to the floor of the enclosure ditch. And that is when the complications began. Because what Barrès uncovered was not a simple, solid monolith. The full body of the Sphinx, exposed to direct observation for the first time in modern memory, was a patchwork of original bedrock and ancient repair masonry from at least 3 different historical periods, layered like geological strata of human intervention. Mark Lehner would later spend years color-coding every visible block by era, producing elevation drawings that read like timelines. But beneath the repairs and the weathering, there was something else. Openings, shafts cut into the stone, fissures that ran deeper than the enclosure floor, features that did not match erosion by wind or water alone. There is a hole in the top of the Sphinx's head, roughly 1.5 meters square and nearly 2 meters deep. Barrès paved it over and installed a metal trapdoor in 1926. The trapdoor is still there. There is Paring's Hole, a shaft drilled 8 meters into the back of the head by Howard Weiss in 1837, when his drill rod became stuck in the limestone and he abandoned the attempt. There is a rump passage at floor level behind the haunches, found when the sand was cleared and then sealed under restoration masonry, nearly forgotten for decades. There is a natural fissure running through the waist of the Sphinx, up to 2 meters wide at the top of the back, explored by Auguste Mariette in 1853. A French journal reported that at the bottom of this fissure, workers found fragments of resinous wood, the kind associated with sarcophagus construction. And there is a keyhole-shaped shaft on the north side, opposite the hind paw, measuring 1.42 by 1.06 meters and about 2 meters deep, which Mark Lehner interprets as an unfinished tomb. Count them. That is at least 6 distinct openings in a single monument, and none of them have been investigated to modern standards. The reason people keep asking what is beneath the Sphinx is not mysticism. It is because the Sphinx keeps showing them doorways, and something keeps shutting them. Here is where the story splits into 2 tracks that rarely speak to each other. One track is the mythology. The other is the data. And the failure to separate them has done more damage to this question than any government restriction ever could. The mythology begins with Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century, who reported that inhabitants of the region believed the Sphinx was hollow and contained the tomb of a king named Harmeis. For 2,000 years, that idea mutated through medieval Islamic legends, Rosicrucian diagrams, and Victorian occultism, until it landed on Edgar Cayce, an American self-described psychic who announced in the 1930s that a hall of records containing the wisdom of Atlantis lay buried beneath the Sphinx's right paw. He set a deadline, 1998. The deadline passed. Nothing was found. But the prediction had already done its damage. It pulled funding, media coverage, and public obsession toward the idea of hidden chambers, and in doing so, it welded the legitimate scientific question to the wreckage of pseudo-history. Every researcher who has pointed a sensor at the ground beneath the Sphinx has had to answer for case before anyone will look at their data. That contamination is the mechanism of error in this story. Not a deliberate suppression of truth by some shadowy cabal, but something subtler and in some ways worse. A reflexive professional association between the question, "Is there something under the Sphinx?" and the lunatic fringe. Ask it at a conference, and you sound like you are about to bring up Atlantis. So credentialed researchers stopped asking. And the question went unanswered not because evidence was absent, but because the question itself had become career poison. Meanwhile, the data was quietly, stubbornly accumulating. In 1977, SRY International, a nonprofit research institute out of California, began geophysical surveys at Giza in partnership with Ain Shams University in Cairo. The project was led by Lambert Dolphin, a senior physicist, and partly funded by the Association for Research and Enlightenment, the organization Case founded. They tried ground-penetrating radar first and immediately ran into the geology. Dolphin later wrote that the Giza limestone was among the worst on Earth for radar, saturated with clay, permeated with moisture from the high water table, and yielding 83% relative humidity at the surface, even in February. Radar signals simply vanished into the rock. So the team switched to electrical resistivity with 1-foot electrode spacings and high-frequency seismic sounding at 30 kHz, which can penetrate up to 60 meters in Giza limestone, where radar fails within a few meters. They identified several minor anomalies. They drilled 5 4-inch test holes on the most significant ones. Every core came back as natural fissure. Dolphin concluded there was nothing significant beneath the Sphinx. Hugh Lynn Case, Edgar's son and the head of the funding organization, accepted the result. Dolphin recalled that Hugh Lynn told him he believed his father's best work had been in healing, not archaeological predictions. That should have been the end of it. It was not. In 1987, a team from Waseda University in Tokyo, led by Sakuji Yoshimura, ran an entirely independent electromagnetic sounding survey across the Sphinx and its enclosure. They laid 7 measuring lines east to west and 4 north to south, covering 70 meters of terrain. South of the Sphinx, they detected a hollow 2.5 to 3 meters below the surface. On the body itself, they found a groove 2 meters wide and 3 meters deep that appeared to extend beneath the Sphinx. North of the Sphinx, a matching groove appeared on the opposite flank. The symmetry raised an immediate question. Was there a passage running transversely beneath the monument, connecting the 2 flanks? In front of the pause, they found yet another hollow, 1 to 2 meters below the surface, that also appeared to extend under the body. The Waseda team published their findings in Studies in Egyptian Culture No. 6, a publication of the university. The report was methodical, technical, and printed in limited quantities. Outside of Japanese academic circles and a few specialists tracking Giza geophysics, almost no one read it. The anomalies it described sat in a publication that most Western Egyptologists would never encounter. Consider what that means. A university team detected potential subsurface structures beneath one of the most scrutinized monuments on Earth, published the data, and the field collectively shrugged. Not because the data was bad, because the topic was radioactive. 4 years later, in 1991, geophysicist Thomas Dobecki teamed up with John Anthony West and geologist Robert Schoch from Boston University to survey the Sphinx with seismic methods, 3 different techniques running simultaneously: refraction, refraction tomography, and reflection. Their results partly confirmed the Japanese findings. Subsurface cavities appeared in front of the front left paw and running back along the south flank. But Dobecki and Schoch also measured something the Japanese survey had not: The depth of weathered rock beneath the enclosure floor was not uniform. At the front and sides, the weathered zone extended 2.5 meters down. At the rear, only 1.2 meters. Schoch interpreted this asymmetry as evidence that the front of the Sphinx was carved centuries before the back, a claim that mainstream Egyptology has challenged on geological grounds, but never definitively refuted. Other geologists argue that the variation reflects differences in the original limestone deposition, not differences in exposure time. The debate remains unresolved. If you are watching this channel because you care about what primary sources actually show rather than what the internet claims they show, this is exactly the kind of convergence worth paying attention to. Different teams, different years, different instruments, and the anomalies keep showing up in the same locations. That matters. But there is a difference between suggestive convergence and proof. And the clearest picture of that gap came in 2001. A Shore Foundation survey deployed commercial ground-penetrating radar with 250 MHz antennas across a 5 by 10 meter area near the left front paw. The survey was meticulous, 2 centimeter trace spacing, 35 centimeters between lines, totaling 7,590 individual radar traces. After processing to sharpen and clean the data, the images revealed 2 roughly parallel subsurface surfaces. The top surface appeared at about 2 meters depth and descended to 3.5 meters near the paw. The gap between those surfaces was the critical question. In solid limestone, it measured 60 centimeters to 1 meter. But if the space was filled with air rather than rock, the true gap could be as large as 2.5 meters because radar waves travel faster through open space than through stone. The researchers published their results through the Society of Exploration Geophysicists. They were careful. They noted that unusually wide, continuous natural fractures filled with conductive material could produce similar radar signatures. But they also noted how specific those conditions would need to be. The probability assessment sat in an uncomfortable middle ground, not proof of a man-made structure, but not readily explained by ordinary geology either. The core problem has not changed in 25 years. You cannot resolve what radar shows without getting instruments, or eyes, into the ground. And that is precisely what has not been permitted. The Egyptian authorities, first through the Supreme Council of Antiquities and later through the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, have consistently declined excavation proposals for the area beneath the Sphinx. The official justification is structural integrity, and that concern is not fabricated. The Sphinx has deteriorated more in the past century of full exposure than in the preceding 45 centuries when sand shielded it. The limestone of Member 2, the soft marly layer forming the body, erodes visibly. Salt crystallization from moisture wicking through the porous rock peels surface flakes off in real time. The water table sits about 15 meters below, but urbanization around Giza has been raising it decade by decade, increasing the capillary action that drives salt to the surface. A poorly placed excavation trench could accelerate water infiltration, weaken the already fragile bedrock, and cause damage that cannot be undone. That is the reasonable argument, and anyone who dismisses it is not paying attention to the conservation data. But the argument does not fully account for the pattern of restriction. In 1993, after the broadcast of a documentary featuring West and Schoch's water erosion research, Zahi Hawass, then Chief Inspector for Antiquities at Giza, expelled their team from the site. When West applied for a new research permit in 1995, it was blocked. Hawass later told the press that pseudoscientists were making personal attacks for personal gain. West told the New York Times that Hawass had obstructed his research. Both were partly right, which is what makes this story so resistant to clean narratives. Hawass was protecting a monument and an institutional framework. West was pushing a heterodox interpretation with real data behind it. The collision produced heat and no resolution. The Osiris shaft tells the other half of this story. The half about what Egypt is willing to excavate when findings fit within the established chronological framework. The shaft sits beneath Khafra's causeway, roughly 200 meters from the Sphinx. Salim Hassan first recorded it during his 1933 through 1934 excavation season, but found the lower levels completely flooded and could not descend. For decades afterward, the shaft existed in a strange liminal state, known to archaeologists but inaccessible. Local guides reportedly used the water-filled shaft for swimming. Village children dove into it on hot days. The crystal-clear water filling the bottom chamber became, improbably, a cooling pool at the edge of one of the most important archaeological sites in human history. Then in 1999, with groundwater levels temporarily lowered due to seasonal fluctuation, Hawass organized a full-scale excavation. His team set up pumping operations that ran continuously, hauling water from the lowest chambers while crews descended through 3 distinct levels. The first, about 4 meters down, was empty and undecorated. The second, deeper, contained 6 rooms cut into the rock and 2 granite sarcophagi. At the bottom, nearly 30 meters below the surface of the plateau, they found the chamber Hawass would call the centerpiece of his career, a raised rectangular stone platform surrounded by water with a massive granite sarcophagus in the center. The configuration matched the hieroglyphic word for house, and the Giza Plateau's ancient name translates to the House of Osiris, Lord of Rastau, where Rastau means the underground tunnels. Hawass interpreted it as a symbolic tomb of the god who ruled the underworld. He dated the second level to the 26th dynasty, around 500 BCE, based on pottery. He called the site the Osirion of Giza. The careful methods used to excavate a flooded shaft 30 meters deep, constant pumping, controlled descent, artifact retrieval by hand, could, in principle, be adapted for far less invasive investigations elsewhere on the plateau. The technology that surveyed one part of the bedrock could survey the part directly adjacent. The gap is not capability. The gap is institutional willingness. And the technology has leapt forward since the 90s. Muon tomography, which tracks naturally occurring cosmic ray particles as they pass through stone, measuring tiny variations in density to map internal structures, was deployed on the Great Pyramid by the Scan Pyramids collaboration between 2015 and 2017. The technique works because muons lose energy as they pass through dense material. Fewer muons reaching a detector on one side means more stone in the path. More muons means a void. The team placed detectors inside the pyramid and waited, accumulating millions of particle tracks over months. The result was the discovery of a previously unknown chamber at least 30 meters long above the Grand Gallery, the largest structural discovery inside the Great Pyramid since the 19th century. The technique required no drilling, no excavation, no physical contact with the monument whatsoever. Fiber optic cameras, meanwhile, can now enter spaces less than 3 centimeters wide. Modern GPR systems operate at frequencies and processing resolutions that make the 1978 SRI equipment look like early sonar. The question beneath the Sphinx is, in principle, solvable without breaking a single stone. The tools exist. The proposals have been written. What does not exist is the permit. But before we settle into frustration, there is a question the data itself cannot answer, and it is the question that keeps this debate honest. The geological reality is that the Sphinx sits in a U-shaped quarry ditch carved from the Mokatam Formation. Member 1 at the base is a hard, brittle reef deposit. Member 2, which forms most of the body, consists of 6 rhythmically deposited beds of alternating hard and marly limestone. Member 3 at the top is dense, relatively pure limestone from which the head was sculpted. Natural fissures, dissolution cavities, and bedding planes run through all 3 members. Not every anomaly on a radar screen is a carved chamber. Some are simply limestone behaving as limestone does over 50 million years, cracking, dissolving, creating voids that look structured on a screen but are chaotic up close. The distinction between a natural cavity and a man-made passage comes down to one thing: The walls. Smooth, squared surfaces mean human work. Irregular, pitted surfaces mean geology. That single distinction is what the entire debate hinges on. And it is a distinction that no remote sensing instrument can make alone. The honest position, which is vanishingly rare on either side of this argument, is this: we do not know what is beneath the Sphinx. We know there are anomalies in the subsurface, confirmed by at least 4 independent surveys spanning 3 decades. We know some could be natural features of the limestone. We know some fall in locations, beneath the paws, along the flanks, running north to south through the body, that are suspiciously consistent across datasets. We know there is a documented history of shafts and openings in the Sphinx that were sealed, backfilled, or abandoned without modern investigation. We know the Egyptian government has legitimate structural reasons to restrict invasive research, and we know that those reasons have sometimes been applied unevenly. Mark Lehner, the man who has spent more time with his hands on the Sphinx than any living archaeologist, began his career as a college dropout in the early 70s, introduced to Edgar Cayce's writings by his parents. He ended up in Virginia Beach, sought out Cayce's son Hugh Lynn, and was eventually sent to Egypt with funding from the Cayce Foundation, explicitly to look for the Hall of Records. He did not find it. What he found instead, over decades of painstaking fieldwork, was the prosaic and genuinely extraordinary truth of how Old Kingdom Egyptians quarried limestone and built temples block by enormous block, in a sequence that tied the Sphinx physically and geologically to Khafra's building program. Working with geologist Thomas Eigner from the University of Tübingen, Lehner matched the fossil fingerprints, the patterns of nummulite shells and coral fragments specific to each geological bed, in Sphinx temple core blocks, some weighing up to 100 tons, back to the exact beds in the Sphinx enclosure ditch from which they had been quarried. The quarry and the sculpture were one operation, inseparable. The transformation from true believer to meticulous empiricist is one of the better stories in modern archaeology, and one that both sides of this debate tend to ignore. Even Lehner, in 2018 and 2019, returned to the Sphinx with GPR equipment, traditional mapping tools, and a Japanese team led by Yukinori Kawai conducting drone photogrammetry and laser scanning to create a complete 3-dimensional model. After 4 decades, he was still surveying. Because the questions persist. And they persist not because of Edgar Cayce, but because of Lambert Dolphin's resistivity grids, Yoshimura's electromagnetic readings, Dobecki's seismic profiles, and Oristaglio's radar traces, all pointing at the same patches of ground and all saying the same thing. There is something here that we cannot explain from the surface. The ground beneath the Sphinx has been scanned, probed, modeled, and argued over for nearly half a century. It has not been opened. Every sensor that has looked down has found something in the noise, and every team that has tried to look closer has been told the same thing. Not yet. Maybe the anomalies are fissures in 50-million-year-old reef limestone. Maybe they are passages cut by people whose names we will never know. Maybe the resinous wood Mariette found at the bottom of the waste fissure in 1853 came from a sarcophagus. Or maybe it was construction debris washed into a crack over centuries by rising groundwater. The honest answer is that we do not know. And we will not know until someone, anyone, is permitted to resolve the data with direct observation. The Sphinx sits on the plateau, facing east, the same direction it has faced for 45 centuries. Beneath it, the limestone holds whatever it holds, and we are still digging, everywhere except there.